Welcome everyone to Fair Territory, back from the GM meetings, perfectly healthy. It seems that only baseball people were the ones who got that nasty stomach virus, and a lot of baseball people got that virus. But the writers, who were mostly not staying at the Omni in Scottsdale, stayed healthy. I have not heard of a single writer who fell ill. So that's good news, and we've got plenty to talk about as always. And we're going to start off today talking about the managerial carousel because that's the hottest news right now. Joe Espada being introduced Monday as the Astros' new manager. He is their longtime bench coach. This will be the sixth managerial hiring this offseason with two to go, the Padres and the Brewers. Let's take a look at what has gone down so far. It's been a big-time run on managers. Bob Melvin to the Giants, Craig Counsell to the Cubs, Ron Washington to the Angels, Carlos Mendoza to the Mets, Espada staying with the Astros, getting a promotion, and Stephen Vogt. We all believe in Stephen Vogt to the Guardians. Now, with Espada, it's an interesting dynamic here, and it's similar to what might take place in San Diego if Ryan Flaherty or Mike Shildt gets the job, and in Milwaukee if Pat Murphy gets the job. These are some of the names that have been circulating as potential frontrunners for those positions. And the reason this dynamic is interesting is because Espada is going from bench coach of his team to manager. It's the same thing that would happen if Murphy goes from bench coach to manager of the Brewers. He's Counsell's longtime assistant. And if Flaherty or Shildt, both of whom were on Bob Melvin's staff last season, goes from their coaching staff to the managing job. The reason why this is interesting is because when a coach is elevated to manager, his relationships with the players understandably change. It's a different dynamic, right? If you're a coach, you're dealing with a player on one level. If you're a manager, you're the boss and you're dealing with a player on another level. And a player might view that coach who becomes a manager as kind of the guy he used to know, right? Hey, wait. We had this relationship this way and now you're telling me this? It's doable. It happens all the time. Coaches get elevated to managers, but it can be something that is not always easy to navigate. Now with Carlos Mendoza, who is going from Yankees bench coach to Mets manager, not the same problem. He doesn't have that prior relationship as a coach with the Mets players. Now, with Mendoza, it's a different story altogether. He's a first-time manager. There are challenges inherent in that elevation as well. But with these coaches, the ones who are elevated, that's something to watch going forward. Now, Espada is an interesting guy on many levels. He has interviewed, I believe, for at least 8 previous jobs. 8! Didn't get any of them. And finally gets the one where he has been all along. Once Dusty Baker decided to retire, the Astros decided, okay, it's Joe Espada's turn. And one thing I think might have helped Espada, and we'll learn more about this in the coming days, is his managing after replacing Dusty Baker in Game 5 of the ALCS. You remember what happened? Brian Abreu hits Adolis Garcia. Brian Abreu gets ejected. Dusty gets ejected. 8th inning, all hell breaks loose. And then Espada has to effectively take over as manager. And he made some moves in the 9th inning, leading up to Altuve's 3-run homer, that were moves I don't know that Dusty would have made. Some people with the Astros did not believe that Dusty would have made those moves. I'm talking specifically about Yainer Diaz hitting for Jeremy Pena, and then Jonathan Singleton hitting for Martin Maldonado. Diaz singled, and then Singleton walked, and then Altuve, the 3-run homer, which gave the Astros a 5-4 victory, and at that time, a 3-2 lead in the ALCS. So, at that moment, if you're the Astros general manager, Dana Brown, who is fond of Espada to begin with, and if you're the owner, Jim Crane, you've looked at that sequence of events and thought, well, here is Joe Espada in the most critical of situations. Game 5 of the ALCS. And he handled it beautifully. Handled it in a way that, again, maybe Dusty would not have done. So that moment, that sequence of events, I don't know if it played a role, but it certainly proved that Joe Espada could handle this. Now, the next day, it was interesting. Dusty was in the interview room. We asked him about that. And Dusty didn't really give Joe Espada credit. It seems that they might have had a little friction there. Dusty basically said, I set it all up. I talked to the players in advance. Whatever. Espada was the guy. Espada pushed the buttons, and he did a terrific job in that moment. One more thing on this. Joe Espada will be the third manager hired this offseason from an underrepresented group. The third out of 6 so far. The other two, Padres, Brewers, we don't know who exactly they're going to hire yet. So that will give Major League Baseball 8 managers from underrepresented groups on opening day. That's the most since 2010. That's a sign of progress for this sport. And I know there are fans out there listening and watching who are saying, Ken, why does this matter? Race should not matter. Ethnicity should not matter. Hire the most qualified person. Well, here's the problem. In the past, and even in the present, the most qualified person does not always get hired. And for that reason, Major League Baseball has taken initiatives to encourage clubs to appoint people to leadership positions that better reflect the diversity of the sport. As a business, that's a healthy thing to do. That's the right thing to do. It's also the smart thing to do. So to me, the 3 hirings, Espada, Mendoza, and Ron Washington, that's a positive step for the sport. Now, one situation that took place in which there were no minorities interviewed, as far as I know, was with the Cubs, the Craig Counsell hiring. Of course, that happened right away. Bang, bang. Ross fired, Counsell hired, Cubs have a new manager just like that. Now, generally, baseball requires teams to notify them when they're making moves, to submit a list of candidates from underrepresented groups that they're interviewing. And when a team does not do that, they generally are required, or expected, I should say, to round out the coaching staff with people from underrepresented groups and do it that way. The Cubs situation was a little bit unusual. It raised some eyebrows at the time because of that, and for other reasons as well, which we will get into. But the Cubs, I would expect, will round out their coaching staff with people from underrepresented groups and keep going in that regard. Getting back to the Counsell hiring and the Ross dismissal, a lot of people in the industry and even outside the industry, just basic normal fans, ask the question, hey, was this proper? Was this the right thing for Counsell to do? Was it the right thing for the Cubs to do? How can Counsell pursue a job when that job is already taken? David Ross was already in that position. And these questions certainly are fair, and I asked them myself. But I sort of came to the conclusion that this was just the way it was going to be, and the order and sequence of events is ultimately inconsequential. Now, people might disagree with me, and I understand that. But here's how I see it. So, the Cubs, when they knew Counsell was available, decided, we want that guy. Whether they dismissed David Ross at that moment exactly, or whether they waited until they had everything in place with Counsell, to me, is ultimately not that important. They wanted Counsell. Just like employers in every industry sometimes want certain people to work for them at the expense of other people. Many of us have experienced this in our own careers, and it's unfortunate, it stinks, it's often unfair, but it's also a reality of the business world. I'm not necessarily selling it as a positive thing, believe me. So once the Cubs decided that this was the direction they wanted to go in, that was that. And ultimately, they just had to do what they had to do. And from Counsell's perspective, you're Craig Counsell, you know the Cubs want you, and they want you over David Ross. You don't have to apologize for that. I don't see it that way. They wanted him, and they were going to dismiss David Ross only if they could get him, and that is simply the way it goes. So that sounds harsh. It is harsh. I don't even like saying it. But in my opinion, this is just baseball, and sometimes the business of baseball can be ugly. We saw it with the Cubs hiring Joe Maddon and firing Rick Renteria in 2014, but that wasn't quite this, because Renteria was a manager that Theo Epstein and Jed Hoyer had inherited. David Ross, of course, was a member of the 2016 World Series champion Cubs, a guy who, as manager, was growing and beloved by the fan base. Not necessarily as a manager. I know they second-guess some things. I get it. But he was someone who certainly was respected. This was not Rick Renteria Part 2. This was a guy that had more invested in the organization, and the organization had more invested in him. But that said, the Cubs saw this opportunity. Craig Counsell was a free agent this year. He was not going to be a free agent again. It was a rare moment in time for them, and that is why they made the decision that they did. Now, as for David Ross, I reported with the Athletic's Brendan Cuddy on Saturday night that the Yankees had approached him about their bench coach position, but he would prefer to return immediately only if he could be a manager. Understandable. This just hit David Ross like a ton of bricks only a week ago. And he is going to take his time, I presume, before jumping into anything. Now, if one of the open managerial positions becomes attractive to him and those teams are interested, the Brewers, Padres, whoever, okay. But it doesn't appear that it's going in that direction. So Ross will likely just sit out the year or maybe become an assistant somewhere. I don't want to speak for him. I don't know. But he could do that and collect his salary for 2024. He had a year left on his contract. David Ross is going to be just fine. David Ross not only is a good baseball person, he's a good broadcaster. He can do that. He can do a coaching position. He can manage. Maybe he can join a front office. He'll be okay. And the way this went down, I don't believe that anyone who was involved was entirely comfortable with it. Not the Cubs people, not Counsell, not anyone. We all know it was the most uncomfortable of positions. And I'm not going to excuse it and say this was a wonderful thing. It wasn't a wonderful thing. But it happened, and it happened for the reasons that I just explained. Now, finally, I want to talk about Counsell's former team, the Brewers. They're in a very interesting situation right now. Their owner, Mark Attanasio, has generally opposed rebuilding. Doesn't want to rebuild. Doesn't like that, and heck, they've had great success over the last many years, coming off a season in which they won 92 games and won another NL Central title. The problem with the Brewers right now, or the issue that they face, is a timeline of players under contract. Corbin Burnes, Brandon Woodruff, and Willy Adames, free agents after the 2024 season. Devin Williams, a free agent after the 2025 season. I wrote about this the other day, and I wrote that the Brewers are open to trading virtually any player on their roster. They seemingly know that they have to retool right now, that their great strength, starting pitching, is about to kind of go away in some regard. Corbin Burnes not re-signing. Brandon Woodruff is hurt. They might even try to trade him, knowing he might not pitch this year. Another team could sign him to a 2-year contract. The Brewers could do the same thing, but I don't know that Woodruff would do that. So they're in this spot, and I know some fans took offense to what I wrote, even though it's based on factual information, and fans don't want to hear that their team might get broken up. But really, from the Brewers' perspective, it's logical to do this. And I know it hurts to say that, and it hurts for a fan to hear that, but when you have this situation, a young core of position players, and you have players that you can trade that have great value. Corbin Burnes, tremendous value right now. 1 year, $15 million most likely in arbitration. A team would jump on that. When you have that, you have the ability to trade those players, perhaps for some young pitching that you could surround your core of young position players with, a core that currently exists and will get even stronger in the coming years, particularly with the arrival of Jackson Chourio, one of the game's top prospects. In my opinion, you do that. And you do that, it hurts, but it makes sense in a weak division to go backwards, to go forwards, to start the cycle all over again. And they're going to do it with a new manager, and presumably that new manager, whoever it is, will understand the situation facing the Brewers and will take the job knowing that they might do some things this winter that will put them in a less competitive position for 2024. It's baseball. It's cyclical. This kind of thing happens even with teams that spend a lot of money. They sometimes take a step back. With the Brewers, it seems to me that it's time. Time now for the Inside Dish. This is the part of the show where I go inside a developing story in Major League Baseball, or sometimes inside a story that I've either written or reported on. And this week I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach. Talk about the Counsell story, which I reported on last week, and explain kind of how it came about and why I made one decision in particular that was kind of a difficult one in the moment. Now, normally, I never talk about reporting process. I don't believe that's something I need to do. These are the methods that I use. The public doesn't need to know them. It's just kind of a competitive thing. I don't want people knowing how I go about my business. And if you go back even to the Astros sign stealing scandal and the story that I wrote with Evan Drellick that kind of broke that whole thing open, we never talked about process until Evan wrote his book, Winning Fixes Everything. At that point, it was years later, and he was willing to share some things, not everything, but some things that we had done while reporting that story. In this case, though, it's a little bit different, and I'll go through it. Going back to late September. Now, in late September, I wrote a story that I generally write every year. It was a story about managers that might be in trouble, managers that could lose their jobs, etc. And in that story, and you can see the headline here, is from September 27th in The Athletic, I raised some questions. Counsell leaving Brewers, Mets cutting cord with Showalter, 10 managers with questions about the future. I didn't expect that we would get 8 changes, but these were certainly some of the teams that had questions about going forward. And in that story, in the section about Craig Counsell, I included one paragraph that I want to go back to here because this paragraph was something I debated at the time. And now as I look back, something maybe I should have written differently. Let's take a look at this paragraph and I'll go through it. I wrote that the Mets might not be Counsell's only option if he chooses to leave the Brewers. His availability perhaps would compel other teams to ponder changes, even if it means moving on from their current managers. Now that paragraph proved to be prescient, but when I wrote that, I actually thought about going even further. I thought about mentioning the Cubs with Ross and even the Cardinals with Oliver Marmol. Why those two teams? Well, it's obvious. Those two teams were the teams that Counsell has tortured over the past several years, or had tortured, as manager of the Milwaukee Brewers. But I pulled back on it because there was no evidence that either Ross or Marmol was in trouble. And I felt that if I wrote that, it might create a situation where aggregators, other websites picked up on it, and it would become a thing. And I've got to be mindful of my responsibility as a journalist here and as someone who does get read by quite a few people. I've got to be mindful that if I write something like that, it could start a whole wave of news, and there was no news at the time. This was not something that was actually real at that time. Well, fast forward 6 weeks, and what happens? Exactly what I wrote, except for the part about the specifics, did happen. So last Monday, I had just landed in Arizona for the GM meetings. I was with my wife, and we hopped in a rental car. She was driving, and that's when all of this was going down. It was interesting. What happened was this. First, Joel Sherman and John Heyman of the New York Post reported that Carlos Mendoza was going to be the new manager of the Mets. Big story. Mendoza, not Counsell, was going to be the manager of the Mets. I'm in the car. I see the tweet. I'm like, okay. And I start digging. Does this mean Counsell is now going back to the Brewers? That was the automatic assumption I would assume most people made, right? Counsell was choosing between the Mets and the Brewers. Made some calls, sent out some texts, and learned quickly from multiple sources that Counsell was not going back to the Brewers. He was going to manage next season, 2024, but he was going to manage a team with an existing sitting manager. The decision then, and this was the critical decision, was whether to go with that news, which is right here. You can see the tweet. Craig Counsell will manage next season, but not the Brewers or Mets, sources tell The Athletic. He is heading to a team with an existing manager. Mets hiring Carlos Mendoza, per Joel Sherman and John Heyman. Again, the decision was, do I go with that kind of tweet, or that specific tweet, when I don't have all of the information? Remember, I don't have where Counsell is going there. All I have is that he's not going to manage the Brewers or the Mets. And the Brewers in particular, because the Mets, as Joel and John reported, were going to name their manager. The question then is, for me, do I release half of the information, which is what it was, or do I wait for the whole thing? Try to get who that team is and which manager is getting fired for Counsell. And I felt at the time that because Brewers fans and fans throughout baseball were wondering if Counsell was going back to the Brewers, that it was important to get out there. It was certainly newsworthy to get out there that Counsell was not going back to the Brewers. I thought of this strictly from a narrow news perspective. That was news. He's not going back to the Brewers. What I didn't realize until later when I was at the GM meetings and different executives mentioned this to me is that that particular tweet sent shockwaves through the industry because teams were starting to wonder, or people in baseball were wondering, is this my team that's firing its manager? What is going on here? And at the time, I didn't know. So I sent the tweet out. Jason Stark sent me a text message immediately saying, whoa, what a tweet that was. I said, I know, I'm going to keep digging and try to find out what exactly is going on here. And that's what I did. Continued texting, continued calling. We're still in the car, still driving to where we're going, my wife and I. And eventually I got the information. I checked a number of teams, but eventually I learned it was the Cubs, and then put up the tweet that he was indeed getting hired by the Cubs. That was at 1:26 p.m., 16 minutes after the initial tweet. It seemed like in the interim, that period from 1:10 to 1:26, it seemed like hours because I was frantic. I was scrambling. I knew other reporters were now on this because I had tweeted it. It's the way our industry works. You see one thing, you start looking for another piece of information. That's what I did when Joel and John reported that Mendoza was going to the Mets. 16 minutes seemed like a lifetime, but that is what happened. And that's the world we live in today. And yes, it was a shocking turn of events. It was something that stunned even me. And usually when things happen in baseball, I'm not shocked. I might be surprised. This was an absolute shocker, not just to me, but to so many people in the industry. And it was just a crazy sequence. But that decision, the decision on whether to go with the first tweet, that he's not going back to the Brewers, that was to me the most difficult one because I don't like to do that normally, but these were extraordinary circumstances. Time now for Dude and Dork of the Week. This is the Dude and Dork of the Week Jason Benetti edition. Yes, Jason is our Dude of the Week. He goes from the White Sox to the Tigers. And he's not just our Dude of the Week because he is a great baseball play-by-play man and someone I've had the privilege with working on Fox several occasions this last season, but he is someone who embodies so much more than simply a play-by-play announcer. This is a guy who has cerebral palsy and who navigates the world with that in as graceful a way as you can imagine. And in his opening comments to the Detroit media, Jason kind of gave insight into his existence and drew a parallel with the Tigers. And I thought it was really interesting. Here's Jason.
I am somebody who does not walk like the average human being. I have an eye that drifts. I have cerebral palsy. Like that is part of me, right? And I quite often get reactions that are not completely representative of who I am as a full person, right? I'm physically different, but mentally I can hold a conversation. And so I do think I get, I guess you would say, underestimated sometimes. And not to say it with a chip on my shoulder, but that's just the way life works. Like sometimes people think I can't do stuff. And from a distance, again, gross generalization alarm going off, but from a distance, I think that's how Detroit gets treated. I think quite often, Detroit is not known for its passionate fans or what it's done for the music industry. I think people reduce Detroit to a couple of statistics. And I don't like seeing people and a whole place get reduced to anything. And I know how much people care. And I know like how much people here want to just matter and be seen for what they are and not some overgeneralization. So to me, as I've thought about this, like that is where we link up. And that is why, you know, they'll make the decision on me. Like I can't say we're going to be the best of friends right away because that's super presumptuous of me. But that's where I think Detroit and I really get along.
Can you say it any better? That is just beautifully put by Jason and sums up so much. And this is a guy who is a special part of our game, period. He is, for what he is as an announcer and for who he is as a person. Which leads us to our Dork of the Week. Our Dork of the Week is the Chicago White Sox for letting Jason go or letting him leave. They didn't fire him, but they allowed him to depart. Evidently, they didn't value Jason Benetti the way the Detroit Tigers did. And I don't know exactly what the reason was. It sounds like, from what I read, some of our people at The Athletic, some others as well, the White Sox didn't love that Jason was doing national games and cutting into his local schedule. That is a ridiculous reason, because when your play-by-play man or analyst does national games, he has an even greater platform. He becomes even more prominent. He's a bigger star. You want those guys. You want Jason Benetti on your team. And the Tigers' gain is absolutely the White Sox loss. And from the White Sox perspective, yes, they've still got Len Casper and they can give him a greater role. Len is tremendous as well. But you had Jason Benetti and Len Casper. I don't understand why you would ever let someone like Jason Benetti go. Time now for Grillin Ken. Let's get to your questions. The first comes from BB Fans of America at DoublePlay42. Question is, the Diamondbacks have stated that third base is going to be an area of focus for them and that they want a right-handed impact power bat to add to their lineup. What are the chances they make a run at trading for Nolan Arenado this offseason? Good question. I am sure the Diamondbacks would love to make a run at Nolan Arenado. The problem with that idea is that the Cardinals are not trading Arenado. And I actually advocated last season for the Cardinals to do just that. Trade Arenado and Goldschmidt, who is entering the last year of his contract. So Brewers fans, it's not just your team I sometimes advocate for breaking up, okay? So I wrote that, but it never really was a serious possibility for the Cardinals. John Mozeliak, their president of baseball operations, has said repeatedly that they're keeping those two guys, that they're trying to build. They want to add 2.5 starting pitchers. It started off as 3. It's now 2.5. They're going to be active in free agency and in the trade market, trying to keep this team or return this team to prominence. That's their plan. In my view, you trade Arenado and Goldschmidt, you build around the young core. It's the same idea that the Brewers would be embarking upon if that's the course that they choose this offseason. But the Cardinals are simply not going there. Next question. This one comes from Luis Miguel Soto, LS Soto. He asks, what are the Rangers' chances of re-signing Jordan Montgomery? It's going to cost them some money. Yes, it will. Jordan Montgomery is going to be a $100 million plus pitcher in free agency. I don't know that the Rangers, though, are going to be that active on him. They want to fix their bullpen. Josh Hader is a reported target. And their rotation right now is in decent shape. It's Eovaldi. It's Max Scherzer. It's John Gray. It's Dane Dunning and Andrew Heaney. And they have some young pitching coming. Jack Leiter, the former number 1 pick, among them. So I don't know that they view the rotation as particularly urgent. Now, would you like to have Jordan Montgomery with that group? I'm sure you would. And I expect the Rangers are going to be aggressive this offseason. They are going to be emboldened by their World Series triumph. They spent the money for free agents the last 2 years, $800 million, and it paid off. So I expect them to be on Ohtani, on Hader, and yes, perhaps on Montgomery and other starters too. But that is not an area where the need is urgent. The final question comes, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, from Jerry Cayley. Jerry asks, the Mets are saying the right things about Pete Alonso, but will they back it up or is he really trade bait? Jerry, that is an astute observation. Yes, they are saying the right things. David Stearns, president of baseball operations, most recently said, we're fortunate to have him. I'm looking forward to watching him play this season, and I'm not going to predict the future. That is the kind of comment GMs and presidents of baseball operations always make until the moment they trade the guy. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Mets are going to trade Alonso. I don't know the answer. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. I would expect that the Mets this offseason, early this offseason, make a run at extending Alonso. Scott Boras, Alonso's agent, said at the GM meetings, the polar bear, Alonso, is not in contract hibernation, indicating that, yes, he is open to an offer of an extension. The problem with this is that Boras is not going to be settling for Freddie Freeman, 6 years, $162, or Paul Goldschmidt, 5 years, $130. Boris, 15 years ago, negotiated a free agent deal for Mark Teixeira that exceeded both of those. 8 years, $180 million. Now, if you remember, Freeman was a free agent, Goldschmidt wasn't, just to give you the full context. But Boris is thinking, I'm quite certain, I got $180 million for Teixeira 15 years ago. I'm not settling for a lot less for Pete Alonso. Not in AAV, not in length, not in anything. So that is where it stands. And if the Mets make this offer, and if Boris rejects it, at that point they have a decision. Do they trade him, which I don't expect, or do they take him to free agency the way the Yankees did with Aaron Judge, and then take their best shot? And if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. You let the chips fall where they may. All right, want to thank everyone for their questions, for listening, for watching. Feel free to like us, to subscribe to us. You know where to find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify. We'll talk to you again, everyone, next week. Have a great week.
Hey, get in on the action with the FT fam at BetMGM. New customers use the bonus code FOUL, F-O-U-L, for a $1,500 first bet offer. Download the BetMGM Sportsbook app on iOS or Android or visit BetMGM.com. Sign up and deposit at least $10 into your BetMGM Sportsbook account. Place your first wager and receive up to $1,500 back in bonus bets if the bet loses. If that bet does lose, your bonus bets will be available once your initial wager is settled. Gambling problem or concern? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.